Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining us today is an author and first-timer making her official debut here on the show. She is a science fiction writer and literature professor with a Ph.D. in Comparative Literature from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA in British Studies from Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. She has studied, worked, lived, and breathed museums during her academic journey, and she has worked at the National Museum in Scotland in Edinburgh and the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. She was born and raised in Salvador da Bahia, Brazil, and this city combines beautiful beaches, a rich history, and a sprawling urban life. With, fun fact, the population is 2,886,698, which is larger than the city of Chicago. She loves her hometown, but is also an avid citizen of the world. And and since 16, she has lived in Germany, Scotland, and the United States. She relocated to Brooklyn 2 years ago with her husband Nick and their three cats, Mr. Chicken, Bunny, and Monkey. And she currently focuses on writing creatively and visiting museums to her heart's delight. And she's currently curing on her first work of fiction, Same Side of Different Coins. It is an earthbound science fiction that will appeal to the literally minded. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest, science fiction writer and literacy professor, Diana Leite. Diana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, you have quite the background, I must say. And honestly, I cannot wait to learn more about you, Diana. So, as a little brief tidbit, is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything that wasn't covered in the introduction?
Not really. I find that my career path feels very unorthodox for people outside of academia because while I was working in towards my PhD, I was doing a lot of other things that contributed to my PhD, but were also their own projects. So I have a ton of museum experience. And I also taught at the university level, and people sort of like sometimes are like, "How did you do all those things at once?" But when you're doing your PhD, it's all part of, like part of the process of getting there is experimenting at those different areas of research.
Awesome. Awesome. And I know you're currently curing your first book, but as a
Mhm.
little teaser, a window into this world you are creating, what can readers expect from this book?
So when I try to explain my novel, the first thing I say is that it's a earthbound sci-fi. So you're not going to see spaceships or laser guns. It is very grounded on realism. So like depicting the world as it is, um, talking a little bit about the current state of society. The science fiction comes in because the two protagonists of this novel are a human person and a extraplanetary being that
Mm,
is billions of years old. And when I was developing my conception of aliens or life outside of this planet, I wanted to really create something that is almost at the edge of what we as humans can comprehend, because I find that whenever we see movies, and again, I'm not, ditching those movies. I love a good space opera. I love Star Wars. I love, um, spaceship and lasers. But that is just not what my novel is about. And when we think about those aliens, they're very similar to humans or to
mm.
animals. And I wanted to think about what would a creature be like that isn't even made of matter as we understand matter.
Ah, okay.
So the interestingly, that my idea is that those beings are basically as old as the universe, And because they're not made of matter, they don't age, they're not sort of like
Right.
liable to, have their bodies decomposed as life goes on. And they're basically passive observers to the universe. And because there's little death in this species, they are very innocent and, like sort of unaware of danger or like human violence. And this sort of like conflict is that some of those beings find that having like a physical body and having the capacity, the sort of like mental ability for like treachery and violence is not something that should be allowed. So that's what I wanted to put in, and it's a very tender adventure. I like to call it. It's like a odd pairing comedy as well. Those are two beings. They're very different, but have like a beautiful friendship that develops, and I find it very fun to see their personalities develop throughout the novel.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I actually like how you said that it isn't like an earthbound science fiction because it's not in space. But whenever we think of sci-fi, that's usually the go-to, that it's somewhere
Mm.
that's not connected to our world. But then again, there's a lot of great sci-fi stories as well as other media that's in the sci-fi genre that takes place on Earth. So I absolutely adore that, Diana. So let's talk a little bit more about you and how this creative passion came about. So growing up, were you always a creative person or did that come about later in life?
I've always been a creative person. It wasn't necessarily geared towards writing at first. I've always been a voracious reader.
Mm,
Um, and that I think informed my desire to write more than anything. Um, I played the piano growing up, I sung. So, like, creativity has always been a big part of my life. I love poetry. My dissertation is on 19th century poetry. I think poetry is extremely powerful, but that is not what, when I sit down to write, that is generally not what I um, gravitate towards, even though every now and then I'll write a poem here and there, but it's very much for like my own amusement, and I have no intention of sharing that with anyone.
right.
But it was like my first literary passion was poetry. But I love stories and I love to tell stories, hear stories. Gossip is nothing else than, storytelling of a different genre. And so yes, creativity has always been a huge part of my life. And I feel like since I started college, I never thought about writing a novel as a
Mm,
serious project until I started college. I feel like that was when I was, I feel like you're too young at 18, like 17, 18, to like really choose your profession. And as soon as I got into college, I was sort of like, I don't know what to do with my life. And I was a biology major for a second, then I changed to journalism. I had like my first year of college was just like changing majors and trying to figure it out. Um, and then I realized I love to read so much. Why can't I write my own novel?
absolutely. Absolutely. And would you say that in college that was actually let me rephrase it. So when would you say, like during your college years, would you consider your aha moment when you realize I want to take my passion of creativity? As you mentioned, you're a voracious reader, you love to read, and with all the stories you've read and continue to read, make the decision to say, you know what, I'm going to take a stab at it. I'm going to write my first book.
So in college, I feel like the dream was born, but I had like a pragmatical mind, and I felt like, as we all know, to be a novelist full time and to live off of that is very difficult
Yes.
without having a second job. So at the time, I felt like pursuing academia, pursuing literature as a researcher, as in a teacher, as a literary critic, as we call ourselves, although I sort of hate that term because if most people hear the word critic and they think that we're just here to like tear things apart and like
Right.
ruin everyone's favorite novel. I am a literature lover and not a literature critic. So um I felt like pursuing that profession as my, um bread and butter and write alongside were sort of like my great professional ambition. As I got into grad school, I realized that writing academically, writing analytically, and writing creatively are really not, a project that you can do together.
Right.
Um, when I was doing my master's, I had a little bit more time available, so I continued to write short stories, take classes, take literary classes. At the time, while I was doing my master's in Berlin, I was part of a group of English-speaking, international people that lived in Berlin that that read poetry aloud. It was a little different than what in America is slam poetry because it doesn't have this element of competition that I feel like is very common in the US where people get,
Yes.
graded and then you like pass through levels. So this element of competition in the US actually like sort of scared me off that scene.
Oh,
But
geez.
yeah, because I find it sort of weird to grade poetry or to have my poetry graded. That is not something that I don't want to invite that sort of scrutiny of my poetry. I feel like I'd be mad if I got like I'd be like an ungrateful guest if I went to like a spoken word and someone, you know, gave me a bad grade. I'd get up like I wouldn't take it easy.
Absolutely, 100%. And poetry is a whole other style of
Yes.
writing, which I've tried dabbling in poetry. It is not easy. And I also liked what you mentioned about when it comes to like academic writing and creative writing, very different mindsets. And it's sometimes not easy to do both at the same time. Sometimes you have to focus on one and then go to the next one, which we will talk on later in the interview. But before
Yeah.
we get to that, let's talk about the creation of your upcoming book. So, when you decide to write the first draft of your story, what were the goals you had going into it as the author, as well as the promises making to your future readers?
So I had the idea for this novel in 2016, and I'm a journaler, so I journal everything. And so I have the first scene I ever wrote for that
Mm,
novel. And originally it was going to be a literary novel with no genre element to it.
mm,
And it was more like a family drama. And as my master's got heavier, you know, as I
right.
started writing my master's thesis, I sort of had to let go of my creative projects for a while. And um, towards the end of my PhD, when I was sort of like finishing my dissertation, was when I started thinking about the project again and thinking, now I'm finally going to have time again to
Right.
dedicate myself to a creative endeavor. Um, and I had like, there's all these stories about people like dreaming about their stories, but this is a real event. I was thinking about this novel. obviously I was like rereading things that I had written before creatively. I was trying to get re-inspired.
Right.
So it was part of a pursuit. It didn't come out of nowhere. But then while I was doing that, I feel like all the things that I was reading at the same time just like came to me this really strange dream. And I felt like this novel, this story, the characters that I had created, which were really interesting, deserved a better framing narrative than a family, than the family sort of struggle that I was working on originally. So
Mm.
I plucked those characters out of the first draft that I had from like 2016 and 2017. And by the time I had sort of like 30,000 words that so like a good chunk. It was not nothing. But I basically just picked those characters and picked certain themes out of the, deep freeze of my creative mind and like and placed them into this new narrative that was a science fiction.
Absolutely. And then from that point, when did sort of family and friends learn that you were embarking on this journey?
Um, I did not share it immediately until I took a pretty radical step. Once I finished my dissertation, I decided to take a year off to focus on writing.
Mm.
And because I thought there is not going to be another moment in my life when I'm going to have like a break, right?
Right.
Because the end of my PhD meant that I had to leave college. I had to change what I was doing, look for something else. And I thought before I go back to teaching or go back to the next step into my career, I want to take this time off to focus on writing my novel. And, like financially, materially, it all worked out. I was really good at getting fellowships during my dissertation, so I actually graduated with a good chunk of money saved, which usually people, graduate with a little bit of debt.
Absolutely.
But um, I don't know. I've been very fortunate, and I also like hustled a lot of fellowships, and I had some money saved, and also like my husband agreed to my with my plan, and I just sat down to focus only on writing for 1 year, and I was insane about productivity. I
Mm.
have an Excel spreadsheet. I had weekly goals, and I tracked every day that I wrote. I know sort of like all my data, how many days it took me to write the novel, how many words a day I would write, how many words a week. And that actually really helped keep me motivated and grounded because one of my big struggles initially was feeling like I would never get there. I would never get to
Mm.
like the end of the novel. Uh, so that really helped because I knew, okay, I'm supposed to be like 20% done by this date. And when that date arrived, I was like 25% done. So
Ah,
it felt realistic.
that is very, very true. That is very true. And actually, what you just touched on is something that is, you know, the writer's struggle, which is real, that we always have all these plans, but of course things can derail those plans, whether it's, a setback in a day or two or something to
Hmm.
come up. And it's sometimes never easy, especially if we made a decision to, have the book finished, have it sent out to an agent or get it edited before you send out to an agent and
Hmm.
all of that stuff, which is, imperative. And especially when it's your first book. When it's your first book, you imprint a little bit of yourself into it. And especially now in the digital age, social media is a great tool, but also a very dangerous one for authors because, yes, and I'm sure you definitely agree, Diana, that while social media can be beneficial for authors to grow their brand and reach out and make connections, network with fellow authors as well as beta readers and so forth. On the other side of the coin or other side of the sword, we do leave ourselves exposed to hate speech, trolls, spam, and so forth. And sometimes, as authors, we have days where we're not in the right headspace. We don't want to write. Mental health is a big issue, and imposter syndrome is also going to be there in the back of our mind, telling us we're not going
Mhm.
to do anything good with this story, or no one's going to read it, and anything more after that. So I'm curious, Naya, in your opinion, have you ever had those moments of imposter syndrome or heightened anxiety? And if so, or if not, what disciplined you to continue, writing this book and getting it to where it needs to be?
I feel like anxiety, yes, always. Um, I'm a very anxious person. Like generally actually writing is the thing that quiets my mind.
Right.
And the struggle, as it is for many writers, is to not let everything else eat into my
Mm,
writing time. It's always the struggle of like saving the writing time, protecting the time with everything that I have. Um, and because I am new at writing fiction, but I'm not new at writing. I've been, like a published professional writer for over a decade. I started writing this novel right after I had finished my dissertation.
mm,
And in a way, it felt so much easier. Like writing my dissertation was extremely difficult in some of the discipline elements that I learned from writing the dissertation and finishing the dissertation helped me create a system that worked very well for me while I was writing my novel. And so, imposter syndrome is something that I've had a lot while I was in grad school. So, I feel like I had overcome
mm.
that by the time I started writing my novel.
Absolutely. And you and I are pretty much in the same boat. I began writing my first book also in graduate school during like the height of, quarantine, the lockdown, everything, and being remote or with everything remote during those 4 years. It did give me an outlet to write and break the boredom, the monotonous nature that we were all affected by during those 4 years, which leads to a very interesting question I want to ask you, Diana, and hear your thoughts on. So, a previous guest I had on the show made a post saying that, in her opinion, the golden age of creativity or a golden age of creativity has emerged, and its ties are directly to the 4 years of quarantine, COVID, and the lockdown. Now, I've been asking my guests this question to hear their thoughts on, and some people have varying opinions. Some people argue that the golden age or such a golden age is on the rise, but we're not there yet. Others argue that we are in the midst of a golden age, while some have argued that we are in a golden age, but the lockdown just sped up. And then I've had people saying that we're not in a golden age because, yes, there's an influx of self-published books and traditionally published books, which that is incredible. But the creativity behind them, as some of my guests have said, is lacking thereof, in their opinion. So there is no creativity or no golden age in that sense. For you, Diana, what is your thoughts on this discussion, and where do you see yourself on this debate?
So, there's many things to this question, which is very complex. And as far as the golden age, I study literature across time, and there's definitely some periods where it feels like literature is having more of a moment. It's always there. It's just that its popularity
Mm,
rises and ebbs as as time goes on. Like for example, the historical period that I study, the 19th century, is the time, the sort of like golden age, using that expression, of the poet. That is the
Right.
moment when the poet was the sort of like highest form of writer. At the same time, it's the moment when Frankenstein is written, and that gives birth to science fiction. And it's, in my opinion, the most important book of the century, of the 19th century.
Absolutely.
So thinking about, I definitely think that is right now a moment that is very fertile in literature. Reading is cool again, and I feel like we see that reflected on book talk and on social media, people talking about books. A lot of big big shows that are based on novels as well, which has always been the case, but not
Yes.
necessarily, we like, it's not necessarily clear to people that those shows are based on books. So now it's like it's a it's a plus for a show to be based on a good book, in a way that maybe in the past they didn't highlight that aspect as much. Um, and I think I don't associate it with COVID as much as I associated with the infrastructure that we have, or the ecosystem, I think is a better word, of self-publishing.
Mm-hmm.
I think self-publishing is amazing. Um, we right now, speaking from the point of view of traditional publishing, is still uh, where most writers want to be, because writers want to be able to make a living out of writing.
Right.
And being an independent writer and making a living out of that is very difficult. So, uh, and I talk about, like, some people are like, oh, but don't focus on money. But it's not money. It's about being able to survive and live and not be wealthy, but like to be able to have like a dignified, comfortable life
Yes.
from our profession. And that at the moment is still on traditional publishing. That is not, there are some exceptions. There are some authors that publish independently that are getting there, but that is still a small minority.
Yes.
So, what I think about self-publishing, which I think is like part two of your question, I think it's wonderful. I think it democratizes reading and writing. I think that it creates a closer relationship between the
Mm-hmm.
reader and the writer. However, you're going to have things like, because we don't have the big filter that the publishing industry represents. You're going to have works of varying qualities, and you may encounter some works that you find um, really bad and that shouldn't have been published at all. But tough luck, anyone can publish anything, and like that means that we have to deal with amazing authors that you would have never encountered otherwise, and you have to deal with some bad stuff, and all that means is that you click next, as you did when you come across, and there's plenty of horrible, atrocious books that are published traditionally. And you ask yourself, was this even read by an editor? Like,
Right.
seriously? There are some books that are that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And but I have this crazy obsession. I'm really obsessed with books that I consider bad. Again, I'm saying that books that I don't enjoy, and I don't see how other people can enjoy it, but they're extremely popular. And I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by even reading those books and trying to like reverse engineer the elements that captivated people in those books. Because those books, sometimes they have something that is very clearly good. For example, the prose is terrible, the narrative is confusing, but the characters are really, really
Yes.
interesting. So I can see why people gravitate towards those books, even though I find it really painful, especially as a literature professor, as an English teacher, to, read those books.
Absolutely. And, understanding the audience and the readership is something that is very important, something that we will touch on in a little bit. And I think it's now a perfect segue into what I like to call the business side of being an
Mhm.
author. So, as a little icebreaker, going back to the introduction. So, in the last part, you are in the curing process for your debut novel. Can you walk us through that process and that decision and how much research you have gone into, that part of the publishing journey?
Yeah, so it's interesting because while I was doing my dissertation, people didn't understand what my work was. And then I was writing a novel and people were like, okay, I know what that is. So I could tell people I'm writing my novel, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I can talk a little bit about the characters and we can have a conversation about that. And now I'm back to the very invisible part of writing that people who are not professional writers know very little about. And I did extensive research. I contacted colleagues. Honestly, one of what I feel like is my struggle, but it's also a lot of other people's struggles, is that I don't have any connections with anyone in the industry. It was difficult for me to get some questions answered. For
Mm,
example, I tried to go to some lectures or, listen to some people speaking, literary agents. The problem is that it's hard to, like, unless you're speaking with someone that is a representative of, Macmillan, it's going to be very difficult for you to know for sure if that is the best advice out there.
absolutely.
So I did a lot of research and I came up with a querying strategy that I'm working through that I feel like is going to be productive. So I queried for about 4 months last year. I finished the book in, so not very long, because I finished the book around May. I let it marinate. I did some revising. And there's a few things that I realized. I realized that the first version of my book, and I have a printed out copy here. So if all my computers and hard drives break, I have it.
All
So I
right.
have it like annotated and things like that. So it's 436 pages on
Wow.
letter paper, which it's bigger than a book, like the size of a book. And one of the obvious things about my book is that it's too long. It's not ridiculously long. It's not like 200,000 words, but for like a debut sci-fi, for it to be, I think it's 111,000 words long. That's a bit on the long side. It took a while for me to get to a point where I was ready to cut certain arches in certain characters for my novel, because I was just like, every sentence I wrote is divine. It must be kept. But it will exist in my heart and in this copy. So now I'm in this phase of the first version. This version is my version. I am happy with this version. I am very proud of this version. And I feel like a lot of science fiction readers would enjoy a longer book. But commercially, I understand that I have to cut about 30% of this novel.
Absolutely. That is again one of the challenging things when it comes to and then curing one's book. Now, I've done that only a few times in my journey. And I realized for me personally, I didn't like curing. I didn't like, kind of on the story, just to fit in the parameters. So I went the direction of self-published independent author. But I realized not everyone is fond of that because even being an indie author, it's still all on you. And sometimes that's a little bit too much for some people where you have to find the editors, you have to find the cover artists, you have to find the time to work on these multiple projects within your book. You have to make sure you have enough money to pay your team, whether that's, a street team, uh, your editors, your cover artists, and so much. And marketing is a huge thing, which
Yeah.
not a lot of people are comfortable doing. And I'm still learning ways how to market my 3 books, and it's a challenge. It is a grind. And within that marketing debacle, you do have, of course, I don't want to say infamous, but you do have that giant monster in the corner, and that, of course, is the audience, who's really going to pick up one's book, who's really going to be interested in a book like this. Because, as I'm sure you definitely agree with, that, and probably you may have taught something this in your classes, but for authors who write their books, we are the target audience because we know the story better than anyone else. But when we write for an audience in mind, we have to consider, okay, where did this book exactly fall under? What genre, subgenre, etc. And sometimes it's a hit or a miss. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. And this is a 2-part question. So the first part is, do you have a good idea of your audience going forward in the publishing process? And secondly, in your opinion, and also as a academic, when should a writer really understand their audience? During the drafting phase or during the, what I like to call, the polishing phase, where you're getting it edited and you're on the verge of publishing it?
Yeah, thinking about the audience is always challenging because we're trying to create a composite of a person, but actually an audience is made up of thousands and hopefully millions of people. Well,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but thousands. I'm very happy to be a middle class writer. I do not have delusions of grandeur, but you are trying to appeal to thousands of people, and you're trying to create a composite of who those people are. Um, and one way that I think about it is taking a parallel with my life. I've never been a popular kid. I've never been someone that everyone understands or that everyone gravitates towards, but I've always had my people.
Mm.
And I just need to find my people. I know I have an idea who those people are. Those are people that are interested in science fiction that have a little bit more complexity in terms of philosophical thinking about how our life is in this planet and how it should be. Um, Thinking about, you know, one of the other big themes of this novel is um, childhood trauma, because the main character goes through a lot of that. And is someone who struggles with mental issues, um, and mental health issues, and that journey is very nuanced, I think. So it takes a certain kind of reader that is a nuanced reader. Um, One of the struggles that I've had thinking about marketing the book is that this book is a little bit, it is science fiction, but it's not what people think science fiction is
Mm.
necessarily. It is subtle, and subtle things are more difficult to sell.
Right.
And it is very much a cross between science fiction and a literary novel. So I
Mm.
feel like it is at that edge. But and while I feel like that does present a challenge when it comes to marketing or even explaining the book to others, I feel like it has an audience. And again, it is for thinking of myself as a potential audience of the book and extrapolating that it's for people that have a sense of humor but are interested in intelligent conversations. I feel like maybe people who are too young might not get this book. There was also a commitment that I had. I didn't want to have characters. They're all like in their late teens, 20s. I feel like there's so many novels where the main characters are in the age bracket. And honestly, I'm loving my 30s a lot better than I did my 20s. And there's like a grit to people in their 30s that I wanted to
Right.
represent in this novel. So, I feel like I think that some young people will like it again as the audience as this composite, but I feel like my audience in general will be a little older and will be interested in science fiction, but also interested in philosophy, interested in human subjects.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into the next question, which is, of course, readership, which you answered, which is, your book is mainly towards, adults, not necessarily for children. And I think it's also another thing authors really need to understand is the readership, because yes, the audience is probably the one thing we're drilled into the most, but readership is kind of like the dark horse in the sense that for readership, you have four main categories: middle grade, YA, NA for new adult, and AF, which each has its own set of rules and expectations. And going back to what you said, Diana, about how, your story is a science fiction novel, but it's not your typical science fiction story. It doesn't flow the same way as your standard book would do. And that leads into this topic of understanding your individuality, but understanding the genre that you're writing in. And sometimes it's an uneven teeter totter, it's a 50-50, because we do want to showcase our individuality as authors, but we also have to understand the genre we're writing in. That's not to say we should not copy it, or let me rephrase it. We don't want to mimic other authors in the genre. We don't want to be like so and so. We don't want to be like Frank Herbert, Brian Sanderson, C.S. Lewis, Brad Thor, or any other author. They can inspire us and influence our writing in some way. But at the end of the day, when a person picks up our book, it's our voice they're going to hear. So for you, Diana, when you began writing this book, how were you able to find this balance of your individuality, but also understanding the genre you're writing in, as well as the audience associated with the said genre?
Well, I understand the genre of science fiction very deeply. I mentioned earlier that the genre is invented comes about with Frankenstein by Mary
Mm-hmm.
Shelley, which is a much misunderstood book because a lot of people, when you talk about Frankenstein, they're thinking about the Bela Lugosi movie of the 20s, the
Oh, yes.
which is amazing, but very pastiche. It has very little to do with the original novel, which is deeply philosophical, even though it has fantastical elements, speculative elements, and some of my favorite books, um, both within the science fiction genre, but in other genres as well, they told the line between there's something fantastical here, but it's also very grounded in reality, and you can you can really picture that happening,
Right.
and you can put yourself there. So I had great inspirations. One of my main ones is Ursula Le Guin and The Left Hand of Darkness, which is again a book that is very creative, even though the aliens aren't really aliens. They're sort of like a her idea is that every planet is populated by human beings that adapted to each planet individually.
Ah,
So they're
okay.
not really completely alien, but the alien of that planet, who are different from humans, from Terrans, they are uh, they are androgynous. They don't have two genders. They are sort of like something in between. And when they are ready to reproduce, they take the quality of one gender or the other, which is very interesting, very nuanced. The book is also about politics. The science fiction is almost like a background to this very interesting
Okay.
political metaphor. So I had those inspirations, but I knew I wasn't doing something like that. Another great inspiration of mine is Anne Rice, also a much misunderstood author because I feel a lot of people um, glob on to the horror element of the vampire, but I feel like her novels are a lot more nuanced than that, even though they have, a lot of violence and gore, which I personally love. But um, it's a novel that answers, it's like her novels, many of her novels, answer the question, what would happen if you had to live forever and the price was that you had to kill others while you lived forever? What would happen to you? And I feel like that she answers that question very seriously, very earnestly, and it makes you think. And that was a great inspiration. But again, I knew I wasn't writing that type of book. Um,
Absolutely. And that's actually very, very interesting. I further bring this up, but this discussion of literacy novels, which for people who don't know, literacy novels, then differences to your standard trade book. Literacy novels tend to focus on, the themes, elements, something that we can draw from, almost what I like to call the 3 E's: educate, entertain, and enlighten. Because a literacy novel, it still wants to educate, or I should say, entertain its readers. It wants them to have an enjoyable time reading the book, but it also wants them to think. It also wants to educate them on certain topics. And as Diana said, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the book, as opposed to the various media renditions of the story, is very, very dark and very, very, thought provoking, especially when you consider that, it is the modern day Prometheus story and what Frankenstein represents and who he eventually becomes. It is a very tragic story, but it also helps us understand, the genre. Because you're right, man. Like, it is the first science fiction story, and then some would also argue that John Carter of Mars, by the author of Tarzan, expanded upon the sci-fi genre and has been coined as being the forerunner to what we would now consider, modern day science fiction novels, where it's off the world and so forth. But all that said, it really comes to the understanding of what kind of author you want to be, which leads to a very powerful question, Diana. And I'll lay context for this one because it is a very loaded question. So, I've been doing this podcasting now for about 6-7 years. I've had the opportunity to meet a wide range of authors from every walk of life and from every stage of the author's journey. And from these interactions, from these interviews, I've come to realize that there are two paths: be an author, to be known as an author. One is dedicated to the art of storytelling, the other is dedicated to the marketing aspect of storytelling. And both have its own set of hurdles. But in this industry, which you've said in the beginning, Diana, that to be a full-time writer, a successful full-time writer, it's not easy. There is no guarantee your first book is going to be the start of your legacy. There are exceptions to that rule, of course, in every industry, but those are the exceptions. Generally speaking, the average person who goes into this industry thinking they're going to be a full-time writer, I hate to burst your bubble, but that's not necessarily the case.
Mhm.
That's not to say it won't happen, but it won't happen immediately. So, Lana, in your opinion, with everything you've learned in your journey, as well as your background as an academic specializing in literature, how would you help someone understand this notion that, yes, just because your first book is not going to be an overnight success, that shouldn't stop you from honing your craft as a writer if you understand your goals and they have to be realistic goals?
Yeah, I feel like it's important to be realistic about how um, writing pays or doesn't pay. It can be very difficult to
Mm-hmm.
get your book traditionally published, which again doesn't even necessarily lead to the equivalent of like full-time employment.
Right.
Uh, but it's easier to get to a point where you can stop working through traditional writing, to traditional publishing. At this point, I believe things may change. I feel like things are trending towards self-publishing, overtaking traditional publishing. I
Mm-hmm.
believe in that, and I'm very hopeful about that. I think it's great because um, like traditional publishing behaves as a funnel, and it makes the books that we have, the selections that we have, less diverse, more uniform. It acts as a huge hurdle and barrier, and reproduces all the issues of lack of diversity that we have in our society. So, but I think that you have to understand your reason for writing
Yes.
very clearly before you do something crazy like take a year off of work to write, which I did. But I also did it very consciously, and I budgeted. It wasn't something that was done sort of like the writing gods will provide. No, it was a very sort of like something that worked due to the resources that I had at the time and due to my living situations at the time. But I feel like people who are trying to be writers and have a full-time job, be kind to yourself because it's not easy. And I worked as a writer for 10 plus years and I never managed to write anything creatively.
Mm.
Um, and I used to think to myself that I was lazy, that I couldn't commit, and it was none of that. I just literally didn't have time. Time is a finite resource. Understand why writing is important to you and what role does that have in your life. I hear a lot from peers who are also writers, but also from people who are not writers, that it doesn't matter if my book gets read or not. I've written it, it exists. I'm happy with the outcome, and that is enough. And I respect that opinion, but it is not my opinion. I intend my book to be read by others
Mm.
because it is not for financial success, even though I'll talk about it in a second because I think that it's an important like political stance that I have. But the reason why I want my book to be read, most of all, is because having your book read, reading someone's work, or having your work read is the highest form of human intimacy that we're capable of. It's the closest we can get to being inside other people's minds.
Yes.
And I find that connection extremely powerful. And I think that my novel has something to teach people and has plenty of moments to entertain people, and to take people along an adventure, a love story, not between the main characters, but between secondary characters that are delightful. I found it really delightful to write them, and I feel like it would delight a lot of people. And writing should be a delight, in my opinion. And so that is the reason why I want my book to be read. Traditional publishing is my goal for the moment, but if that doesn't work, I am 100% going to self-publish. It's just a matter of I wanted to give traditional publishing a real try before I publish um, independently. Uh, and it's okay if my book is only read by 100 people. It would be great if it's read by more than that, but I would be satisfied if only a few people read it. Now, speaking about livelihood, because I think that is important, it is
Yes.
very sad, it is very tragic that we live in a society that does not value culture, that does not value art. And we, all of us who are writers, who are professional, serious writers, who dedicate ourselves to this craft should be able to make a living out of it. And that should be aided by the government, in my opinion. There are some fellowships, but it's very sporadic, and usually the people that get them are like famous people. But it is very sad that we live in this world, but unfortunately, that is the reality. So prepare yourself for that reality and make sure that your goals are realistic, and that if you're going to take time off to write, that you have like a serious financial planning in place so you don't get yourself in trouble. And I've been at this since it's going to be 2 years. And I wrote the book, and it's been about a year since I've been querying, revising, querying, and maybe it's going to take another
Absolutely.
years. So, and that doesn't mean that I'm going to have a full time, like be able to live off of my writing in the meantime. So you do have to plan to have a job while you're in this process, and maybe be able to take breaks in between. Um, that was possible for me. I know it's not possible for most people, but take a sabbatical out of work, get sort of like take an unpaid month off, um, to focus on your writing. But yeah, it sucks. Like,
Yeah, that is probably the hard truth about being a writer, that it's liberating, but it also has its moments. It is a very
right.
lonely process because you're putting all your time and effort into something which may or may not see the light of day. And that has to be, accepted and realized early on. But also during those moments, the one thing that's also really good about the writing world is networking and connecting and building good rapport. So, Diana, would you like to take this moment to give shout outs to people who have helped you along the way? They could be fellow academics in the humanities, or fellow writers or authors you've connected personally. Anyone you want to give a shout out to?
um, I'm going to be that person. Like my number one supporter and cheerleader have been my husband Nick Vollmer and my father Antonio Leite, who have been helped me, who have helped me materially and intellectually. I have many great friends who have been part of this process, that are too many to count. But I have to say that within the industry, I haven't been very well connected. I don't know a lot of people who are at this within the fictional world who are, in this process. I would like to know more people, but I just haven't found that community yet.
Well, that's gonna be changed, Diana, because after this interview, I'm gonna get you in contact with a lot of my good friends in the publishing world, which include fellow authors, editors, narrators. If you ever decide to go down that direction, I'm more than happy to connect you with these incredible people. And on that topic of, networking and learning from these individuals, we've now arrived at the final question, Diana. So, with everything you've learned thus far, from your academic journey to now writing the book to now writing the query letters to get it out into traditional publishing, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors and writers who want to get into this industry?
I have two things I want to say. One is about the writing process itself. That it's
Okay.
the biggest tip I've ever learned is simple is sophisticated. You don't need to make it complicated. That is what I have written everywhere, sticky notes. Simple is sophisticated. So if you can't say something in a sentence, don't say it in 3 paragraphs.
Mm.
Um, and for the people out there fighting to get published in the trenches with me, our people will find us. Like there's also I know that my book is not for everyone, but my people are out there and they'll find me, and your people will find you.
Awesome. That is a perfect way to end this amazing author interview. Thank everyone for joining us today. A huge thank you to Diana for making her official debut here on the channel, and we wish her the very best on her journey with her book. Now, Diana, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and stay up to date?
So the easiest form is to find me on Instagram. My handle is at Diana with one N Leite. That is Leite as in Tom E. You can tell that I've said that to people on the phone many times. And I also have a TikTok that is at Diana.et.apollo with two L's. Diana and Apollo are twin gods, so that's my little, like a Greek mythology joke for you. Um, Roman mythology, because Diana is the Latin name. But you can find me there on TikTok. I'm in my early days of my social media life, because I've always been one of those people that like has social media, but it's more of a lurker. So now I'm starting to create content. So there will be things for you to watch.
Awesome. I'll link all that down below in the description of this video. Thank you everyone again for joining us for another amazing author interview here on the channel. Again, a huge thank you to Diana for coming on the show, making her official debut here on the show. And we wish her the very best on her journey from one author to another. Diana, thank you so very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And as always, viewers and listeners, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below and stay up to date with the next set of interviews slated this week and the weeks after. And if you're going to be in the LA area, I'm going to be at the Festival of Books on the 26th and the 27th. So if you want to meet me in person, that is where I will be. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And until next time, enjoy your day.